Shabbat Shalom. So, the first Sabbath after camp is always great because I get to wear my casual clothes and my shirt. So will our campers come on up? And camp staff? Come on. Yeah, come on now, yeah. So we always do, for those who hadn't been here after one of our youth camps, we always do a kind of a testimony. Let them share with y'all. You know, our church really supports our youth and really supports them going and being encouraged by some of these camps. And they do get poured into in a way that's just really awesome to witness and to see. And so we always want to come back, and people actually tune into our service every year after. I just made them nervous by saying people tune in. But people from camp always listen in to hear what the Lord did for them through camp. So I think they're in a pretty good line here, so we'll just go down the line.
Morning, everybody. Camp was pretty great this year. I felt like I got poured into by a lot of the leaders over there, specifically Mr. James King. We talked a lot. Mr. Bradley, he's a cook for one of the young adults camps, so I hope I can go to one of the future ones coming up. Mr. Adams, another one that he really poured into me this past weekend. It was really great talking to him. But just a fellowship, seeing some old faces, making some new friends, it's all great. So thank y'all for supporting us so we can make that trip up there. Thank y'all.
Good morning. First, I want to thank y'all for anybody who supported the fundraising for allowing us to go. I really appreciate that, and I really enjoyed camp. There was some great fellowship, there's some great teaching, some great worship, and I just overall really thank all y'all who participated. Thank you.
Hello. I was under the impression we were going to wait because that's what Savannah told me because she wasn't here, but it's cool. Yeah, she'll do a solo next week. Y'all come back for that. Camp this year was really cool. I got to be on staff, and I got to work with a group of 14-year-olds. So I really got to, dive into, I had to think back, what was I going through when I was 14, and I had to go, do some self-reflecting on, man, my life has changed so much since I was 14, and, I want to pour into these girls and help them avoid some of the decisions that I made from 14 to 19, and it was just really cool to be able to actually pour into other young girls, and I just thank you guys a lot for supporting us and letting us go to camp.
So I really liked what Mr. Bryan said in his teachings, and I liked the worship.
A little bit closer.
And thank you for supporting us.
I really love church camp because it led me closer to the Lord, and I liked how all the Christians there supported me.
I liked the teaching and worship.
I had a really good experience with church camp. I was a little nervous going into it, and my favorite part was worship, and the songs really impacted me and led me closer to God. So.
I also enjoyed the worship. I enjoyed worship, and I enjoyed the teachings because it helped me draw closer to God, and yeah, that's it.
So I'll tell you, some of these younger ones, we've got to work on their testimony giving a little bit. I know they're super nervous. I'll highlight a few of them. I know I saw Zep dance her heart out like nobody else. She danced and learned a bunch of new grooves, so we're going to play a song so she can come up here and show us some of her dances. No, I'm playing. One thing, Mariah had a whole thing written out. She got apparently too nervous to read it. But she had a word spoken over her by Brian Serrano that she, doesn't have to live in my shadow, that she needs to shine her own light or let God shine his light through her individually. And it was really awesome, and she had a few people pray over her in different ways. And then Nisi, who I affectionately refer to by her full name, Tennessee, the whole week. We give an award every camp for, I forgot what it was called now. What was it? What's that? Best Friends Award. It's the only award. It's the only thing they do for camp is Best Friends Award. And so Nisi got the Best Friends Award for exemplifying Christ the whole weekend, for always jumping in to serve others, always being a best friend. And then she also, in the same vein but at a different time, said someone came and spoke a word over her that she had the spirit of Jonathan, which falls right in line with that she was operating and working as a friend to every single person she saw this weekend. So just some really good, awesome things for our youth. And they give that award for one female, one male. So she was the only female, one of two people out of 131 that the leadership saw. And the leadership votes on that. They observe the campers throughout the weekend or the week in the summer and vote on it. So really awesome for that. It was a blessing. It really was a blessing. We appreciate y'all in giving, appreciate y'all's support, and they definitely get a lot out of it. All right, this morning we're going to continue our work, our study here in Nehemiah. So this morning we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 10. If anybody needs to leave, y'all can. And so here we're going to see in chapter 10 this commitment to action that Nehemiah is going to bring the people to. Nehemiah's, led this rebuilding project for the walls, but here the people are rebuilding something even more important. They're rebuilding the covenant relationship with God. And we talked about last week in chapter 9 this beautiful poetry that goes throughout the chapter and really displays God's character throughout the history of Israel and how he's done mighty works and how they were going to move forward in that context. And here we see some action. It's not just words. It's not just this poetry that happens in the last chapter. It's not just saying things, but they're going to put into action the stuff that needs to be done. And we start off with kind of a long list of names here, but the key idea is that true commitment to God involves action, sacrifice, and community. That's the bottom line up front for this chapter. So let's read the chapter. We're going to start one verse back, like I said, because in our Hebrew Bibles, chapter 10, verse 1 is actually in the English Bible, chapter 9, verse 38. If you have a TLV, just go to chapter 10, verse 1, because that's on that idea. But it's just one verse. So, verse 38 of chapter 9, in view of all this, we are making a binding agreement in writing on a sealed document containing the names of our leaders, Levites, and priests. Those whose seals were on the document were the governor, Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah, Sariah, Azariah, Jeremiah, Pashur, Amariah, Malchiah, Hotush, Sebaniah, Maluk, Harim, Meremoth, Obadiah, Daniel, Ginnathon, Baruch, Meshullam, Abiyah, Miamin, Maaziah, Bilgal, and Shemaiah. These were the priests. The Levites were Yeshua, son of Azaniah, Benui, of the sons of Henadad, Kadmiel, and their brothers, Shebaniah, Hadiah, Kelita, Peliah, and Hanan. Micah, Rahab, Hashabiah, Zakur, Sherebiah, Shebaniah, Hodiah, Bani, and Beninu. The heads of the people were Parash, Pahath Moab, Elam, Zatu, Bani, Buni, Azgad, Bebai, Adonijah, Bigvai, Adin, Ater, Hezekiah, Azor, Hodiah, Hashum, Bazai, Harif, Anatot, Nebal, Hagpiash, Meshullam, Hazir, Meshezabel, Zadok, Yadua, Pelatiah, Hanan, Anaiah, Hoshea, Hananiah, Hoshub, Holahesh, Pilha, Shobek, Rehum, Heshabna, Maaseiah, Ahiah, Hanan, Anon, Maluk, Harim, Baanah. The rest of the people, the priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, and temple servants, along with their wives, sons, and daughters, everyone who is able to understand and who has separated themselves from the surrounding peoples to obey the law of God, join with their noble brothers and commit themselves with a sworn oath to follow the law of God given through God's servant Moses, and to obey carefully all the commands, ordinances, and statutes of the Lord our Lord. We will not give our daughters in marriage to the surrounding peoples, and will not take their daughters as wives for our sons. When the surrounding peoples bring merchandise or any kind of grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day. We will also leave the land uncultivated in the 7th year, and will cancel every debt. We will impose the following commands on ourselves: to give 1/8 of an ounce of silver yearly for the service of the house of our God. The bread displayed before the Lord, the daily grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbath and new moon offerings, the appointed festivals, the holy things, the sin offerings, to atone for Israel and for all the work of the house of our God. We have cast lots among the priests, Levites, and people for the donation of wood by our ancestral families at the appointed times of each year. They are to bring the wood to our God's house to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We will bring the first fruits of our land and every fruit tree to the Lord's house year by year. We will also bring the firstborn of our sons and our livestock as prescribed by the law, and will bring the firstborn of our herds and flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who serve in God's house. We will bring a loaf from our first batch of dough to the priests at the storerooms of the house of our God. We will also bring the first fruits of our grain offerings, of every fruit tree, and of the new wine and fresh oil. 1/10 of our land's produce belongs to the Levites, for the Levites are to collect the 1/10 offering in all agricultural towns. A priest from Aaron's descendants is to accompany the Levites when they collect the 10th, and the Levites are to take 1/10 of this offering to the storerooms of the treasury in the house of our God. For the Israelites and the Levites are to bring the contributions of grain, new wine, and fresh oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are kept, and where the priests who minister are, along with the gatekeepers and singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. Amen. Amen. Whenever we look here at the first of this chapter, we see them continuing on from the last chapter, and because of all the things that they've declared to God, because of all the things they've recognized that God has done in their past and in their history, they said that they were now going to seal this covenant before God. And then you have Nehemiah's name is signed on here first. I know in the workplace or in the military, it's always good. Some lesson I've had to learn is delegation, that you need to delegate tasks. You can't do it all yourself. Sometimes it's our own pride that wants to control everything. We don't give people the opportunity to do their jobs. But sometimes, and I'm sure y'all have seen this, you have the people that delegate too much. Everything is everybody else's job. I think here, with Nehemiah, his name is first on the list. And as we've seen by his character, he's the first one to serve. He's the first one to go out and do the work. He's the first one to bring the people together and put the hand to the plow. And I think that leadership shows here. The reason he signs first is also, obviously, because he's the governor of the city. And some people refer to what follows, not the signing, but what follows later in the chapter as Nehemiah's code, that this is his leadership has brought people together to be able to agree as a community to act a certain way. Most communities have that. It's not necessarily written down. I think that we would all agree that there are certain behaviors that are inappropriate in our community. And so they're going to say these things. They're going to list these things. But here you have Nehemiah's name listed first. It's sealed first. And following him is someone named Zedekiah. And most scholars would say this is probably referring to his scribe that's later called Zadok in Nehemiah 13:13. But a scribe was not just someone, as we think of, that just writes things down. Scribes had responsibility. They had authority. This would be the right-hand man of Nehemiah the governor. It would almost be like a vice governor, the person who's second in charge. And most of the names of this list, as we pay attention to them, are not individuals, but they belong to families. And if you remember, as we've talked before, the community here is represented by clans or families, and they've communally agreed to keep this covenant. And this is a theme that goes throughout Ezra and Nehemiah, this idea that the nation is now emphasizing on the families, the people, where they haven't before. If we read our Bibles, and Nehemiah kind of goes out of order in sequential order, right? It's found before the prophets, but this is happening after the prophets have come and prophesied. This is after the exile. But if we read it in sequential order, we would see all of these prophets coming and saying, you've treated your neighbors, you've treated these families as if they're slaves, you've treated them as if they're worthless. And then here, in the return from exile, the focus is on the people who had no value beforehand. I think that there's power in what we would say intergenerational faith. And I don't think that can be overstated. As we look in the room, and we just had young people, most of these young people just went to camp for the first time. We had a lot of people turn 13 this year and able to go to winter camp. A new generation. A new set of young people that are going and being encouraged, but not just there, here. This next generation coming up and learning about the Lord. And I don't think that we can overestimate the power of raising our children up in the word of the Lord. 2 Timothy 1:5 says, I recall your sincere faith that first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and now I am convinced is in you also. That's Paul speaking and encouraging him about his faith that are so strong because of the faith of his ancestors. We go back to I didn't put it here in my notes, but we go back to the most popular verse in the Old Testament, which is Exodus 34:6-7, I believe, where it starts off, the Lord, it talks about his graciousness and how he's long-suffering. And it ends by saying that he would not allow those who live in wickedness to go beyond 3 generations. But when he talks about the faithful, he says that he'll bless them for 1,000 generations. There's not even been 1,000 generations since Moses spoke that, or since Moses spoke that in God's presence. There's not been 1,000 generations. If we take 40 years as a generation, or even 30, there's not been 30,000 years since Moses met with God on Mount Sinai. What's the implication? That evil that lives in a family can easily be broken, but when faith is passed down, it is strong as oak, that it'll be maintained. It's not a promise, right? We definitely have examples. We can all think of examples of families where young people who were truly raised up in the Word don't go in it after they become old, but I think we can see that generally, as a practice, God says that that's the case. And the transmission of these religious beliefs and these practices from one generation to the next links these youth to their parents and to their grandparents, but most of all, it links them to God Himself. It links them to a long line of ancestors who have been built as a foundation for our faith, but through God's promises. Every generation, it's building more, building more, building more. And we see this throughout this chapter, this concept of family and the importance of family and the fact that family has to be brought in, and family agrees to the covenant, and family understands the covenant because it's vital for God's kingdom to grow. This list here includes 21 priestly names. 13 of them are mentioned in Nehemiah 12, and the other names in Nehemiah 10 may represent individuals who kind of came after the exile, that they were people who joined in Jerusalem afterwards. We think about the witnesses who sealed the document. They represent all of the community. It's not just the priests who are signing on to this document. It's not just the governor and the officials who are running the city. It's not just even the priests and Levites and the governors, but it's the whole assembly. It's political leaders, priests, Levites, and every family that's part of the community. I think that's vital. I think it's typical of Nehemiah's leadership. I think he assembles and he obligates all categories of people just like he did when they were building the physical structure of the walls around Jerusalem. If that's the case, how much more important would it be that they're all involved with building and rebuilding God's people? Because that's really what's going on here. It's a rebuilding of God's people. And it's not the only time it's happened. I would suggest that throughout history, over and over again, God's people are rebuilt, built up and rebuilt. I was thinking of his leadership here and Nehemiah's leadership throughout this story. There was a guy, Don Price, and he was over gravity payments. And long story short, he was the CEO. And whenever there were tough times, he took a pay cut to make sure that every single one of his employees could keep their job. Like, that's Nehemiah leadership. I thought of that story whenever yesterday I was in the gym and some guys getting ready to go to work, and they were talking about the disparity in some companies where the CEOs are making $50 million a year. And this is probably bad to say in a country where most people love capitalism, but $50 million a year. $50 million, that's a lot. While they have people making less than minimum wage, less than a living wage within their company. I wouldn't say that's Nehemiah leadership. In Israel, we go to a place in Bethlehem, it's called Tabash. It's this great olive wood shop, and if I was a wealthy person, there's this one olive wood thing that's like this big, and it's Jesus and the waves whenever he calms the storm and the seas, and it's just this beautiful, just hand-carved olive wood statue. It's like $4,000, so like I'll never buy it, but I like to look at it. I take a picture almost every time I go. But I had met the owners back before COVID, and then when we went back after COVID, I was talking to the owners, and I said, how did y'all manage to keep your shop, through COVID? And he said, I've been blessed my whole life. I had enough that I didn't need to take a single penny from the company, and I paid my workers even when they couldn't come to work. He said for the first, I think it was 18 months, his store never opened, and he had 3 employees that would come and just ship items outside of Israel. So they were actually working, but everyone else he still kept on the payroll, still supported them. That's Nehemiah leadership. The covenant here was not just for the leaders, and that's the point. It wasn't just the leaders who were going into covenant with God, but the whole community. And I think I even think of myself at sometimes, I would even say, well, I'll represent the whole community so I can make this agreement. Not at this time. Not for this covenant. Nehemiah saw that the entire community, priests, Levites, and all the people had a responsibility. It wasn't just that they were signing an agreement that God would do certain things for them, but they were signing on to an agreement saying, this is what we'll do for you. Anybody else want someone to sign a covenant or an agreement for you without you having any say-so or volition in the process? I always talk about vows when we do weddings, and I'm preparing for another wedding this spring and doing marriage counseling, and we talk about vows, and I always have to tell people, look, a vow is a promise. Because most time when I tell people to write their own vows, they get up there and, I love you so much. You're so beautiful. I'll love you till the day I die. And I'm like, okay, there was a little promise in there. Include a love letter, but please put some promises. You're promising to do something. We're here today for a covenant. And I always tell them, it's okay to read them before. You can share. You can even talk with each other about what those covenant promises are. And with Savannah and Ian, they were like, well, a lot of people don't do that. You read the vows when you get there. And I'm like, well, what if Ian puts in his vow that I promise to wake you up every single morning at 3 a.m. with an air horn? You're at the altar. You going to say no? Know what you're getting yourself into. Here in verses 28 through 31, it talks about this commitment of the community. after all the signers are signing on to it, and after all of them are listing the names of those who are going to put their stamp, their literal stamp of approval on this covenant, it goes into this commitment of the community. And it says that there's this phrase, the rest of the people. And this opening phrase encompasses the groups that are listed after 28 through 31, which are referenced here. And this is often the case in Ezra and Nehemiah, where beginning with the priests and the Levites, and then it goes on to the laity, the people there. But I think the laity are distinguished by the fact that they too have kept themselves separate from the local populations. They too have been committed themselves to observe the law, the instructions of God. They have separated themselves from the peoples of the land. And this phrase, they kept separate from the peoples of the land, includes, in my opinion, proselytes, people that have come to Israel since they've returned to the land. They see the work that's going on, and no doubt there were people that saw how God protected them through the building of the wall and said, I want to be a part of your community. I want to be a part of your faith. I want to come and serve your God. No doubt it would include the proselytes. And here the people that separate themselves from the other peoples of the land then are Israelites who don't allow this intermingling to happen. They don't allow themselves to be influenced by those who don't serve the Lord, the God of Israel, and the non-Israelites who become Israelites through faith. We see this back in Ezra 6, how locals joined their Passover celebration. And if you know anything about Passover, Exodus 12 says that anyone who would want to have faith in the God of Israel could join them on Passover and be just like the native-borns. I think what's interesting is that the instructions of God, the instructions of Yahweh, the law, the Torah, this is the unifying element. This is what is stated here in verse 28, that so many of all these people are being unified around the God of Israel and his instructions. And there is so much packed in understanding that. Because it's not like they said, we have our own rules over here, but y'all's might be better. I'll just come over there and do y'all's rules, right? If we read it kind of flatly, we can kind of understand it that way. We can think, well, they're just trading their rules for these rules. It would be like moving from Russia to the U.S. I think the U.S. is a freer country. I'll be freer there. Let me go live under those rules. I don't think that's what it's saying. The implication of unifying around Yahweh and his instructions is a unification around the trust and the belief and the faith in Yahweh who gave those instructions. And here it mentions that those who have kept themselves separate and they're unified around these instructions of Yahweh, it includes their wives, their sons, and their daughters, all who could know and understand. Everyone who could know and understand. It refers to the inclusion, again, of the whole community. As long as they could understand the commitment that they were making, they had the ability to come and be a part of signing on to this agreement, to this covenant. And I think the text emphasizes the importance of the entire family here. Not just being present, not just being represented, but the entire family knowing and understanding the Word of God. The family heads, the fathers, the mothers, not only had to commit to this belief and this practice and this commitment to the instructions of Yahweh, they had to commit to teaching them to their children. They had to commit to leading their children in the way that they should go, in the ways of the Lord. The commandments of God are so important that Scripture even urges parents, as we know, to impress them upon their children. Deuteronomy 6:4. I was talking with someone earlier this week and talking about how a lot of times in the church, even in our space of the church, our space of the body, we forget the fact that our faith and our commitment and our belief, our walking in the footsteps of Jesus, of Yeshua, means that we're part of a very real kingdom. I think sometimes we lose sight of that. We are citizens of a real kingdom. And in that conversation, I was telling him how I believe that the Shema is like the Pledge of Allegiance to that kingdom. Deuteronomy 6:4-8 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the way, when you lie down, and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates." Part of what I would say is the Pledge of Allegiance to our kingdom, Israel, is the instruction to tell our children about it. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord." Sometimes I got to work on that, not stirring up anger in my children. Verse 29. Verse 29, it says that they took a sworn oath. And the instructions here, or the language here in this verse is instructive as well. The nobles, these people who are the officials of the community who signed on to the oath, are first and foremost brothers, and then they are leaders. But if yours reads like mine does, in the CSB, it says they took a sworn oath, but the verbiage there literally says they took an oath and a curse. They entered into an oath and a curse. And when I saw this, it wasn't in a few of my English translations, it wasn't there, and I'm going back through the Hebrew reading it, it's there. They took an oath and a curse. Why would they take a curse? I kind of had the question in my head, but I think it's pretty simple. There's a scholar, Yamuchi. He says, a curse means an adjuration with an imprecation of grievous punishments in case of the failure to keep an oath. Or in layman's terms, if you take an oath, you also take the curse if you don't keep it. They understood that taking an oath meant that if they didn't hold up their end of the bargain, if they didn't do what they said they would do, if they did not do what they promised to do, that there would be repercussions. And who better to understand that than the generation that has come out of exile? The generation that spent their entire lives, most likely, raised in Babylon, not in the nation of their fathers. Verse 30, here we see this Nehemiah code, as some call it, really kick off. After signing and witnessing the covenant in general terms, the people, they then go to specific regulations. And when we look at these from here to the end of the chapter, all of these are set forth in the Torah, the instructions, the first 5 books of the Bible, in some form or another. But I really love this passage because it really challenges us in how we read the instructions of our Lord. Because if you were like me early on, I was so black and white when I read any of the instructions from God. Well, if it doesn't say exactly that, I don't have to do it. If it doesn't say exactly that, I can do it. Nehemiah here challenges that. I don't think he was intentionally challenging it. I think our modern idea and our concept of how we view the instructions of the Lord are challenged by Nehemiah's approach. And not just Nehemiah, other people. Here he takes these instructions that he finds in the Torah and he applies them to their current situation. He takes them and he says, here is what the Torah said or the law said. Here's what we're going to do with it. This activity that is first, this here and how Nehemiah is doing this is kind of the first indication of what we see later on, this exegetical practice where specific laws are found within the Torah and then selected for discussion and application for present circumstances. Take, for example, Leviticus 19:18 says, "Do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. I am Adonai." Well, today, I can take that and I can say, don't cuss at drivers when they cut you off or evoke road rage, right? But God doesn't address how we drive. He addresses that we're to love our neighbor. There's a whole host of things that we could say that are not addressed in the Torah, but we have to take them and apply them to our own situation, to our own lives. Here he takes intermarriage Intermarriage and this idea of marrying other foreign wives is forbidden in Exodus 24 and Deuteronomy 7. They're not to marry foreign wives. Why? Because they will lead them away from God. They will lead them astray so that they'll go and serve other gods. God says this because those cultures were known for worshiping other deities. In those instances, specific groups are mentioned. The Hethites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, if I read this through the lens that I used to read, I would say, well, I don't know any Jebusites, don't know any Perizzites, so I think I'm good. I could marry whoever I want to. I could marry a Buddhist woman if I read it the way I used to. But here, that's not how Nehemiah understands it. Here, Nehemiah doesn't explain this intermarriage concept and the concept of specific peoples, because those were the peoples who were there when they entered the land, but he approaches it in a comprehensive sense. We see this in the New Testament. The idea of being unequally yoked. Because if we're unequally yoked, if we're bound together in a covenant with someone who does not believe in the God of Israel, then we're tempted to go astray from the God of Israel. Here, it's comprehensive. Anybody who would not be in covenant with our God, you should not be attached to in covenant. That's what he says. He takes something that's very specific in the Torah and he makes it something very broad because he understands the purpose. In verse 31, we have this concept from taking wives to now we're talking about taking things on the Sabbath. Very neat little literary transition. We go from taking wives from foreigners, and foreigners does not mean that I can't marry someone. Well, I can't marry anyone. I'm married already, right? So I'm already married. But it doesn't mean that a person in the U.S. cannot marry a person from France. The foreigners in our Bible means people not in covenant with God. But here we move from taking wives from non-covenant people to taking things on the Sabbath from non-covenant people. There's this beautiful flow in this connection. And if you've ever heard some people comment on this, you might even have heard them say that Nehemiah actually was adding to the Torah, that this isn't as inscribed, or some people use this to justify buying and selling on the Sabbath, but this is actually not Nehemiah's concept. Go back to Jeremiah 17:24, where it says, however, if you listen to me, this is the Lord's declaration. This isn't even Jeremiah's declaration. This is the Lord's declaration. And do not bring foods through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but keep the Sabbath day holy and do no work on it. This is before the time of Nehemiah, before the exile. Jeremiah is warning them that they were desecrating the Sabbath by doing business. Amos 8:4-5, hear this, you who trample on the needy and do away with the poor of the land, asking, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain in the Sabbath, so that we may market wheat? We can reduce the measure while increasing the price and cheat with dishonest scales. They maybe weren't selling on the Sabbath, but they were counting down the hours until they could. I'll tell you one of my convictions years ago, and you may have been here. It's Yom Kippur. And you're fasting, not just a normal fast, you're fasting from food and water, any liquids. And it gets to be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden, how many more minutes and seconds do I have to do this? It's not the right heart. It's not the right mentality. In this case here with the Sabbath, it's referencing the peoples of the land again. They're once again a big concern. They're a concern when it comes to taking wives. They're a concern when it comes to taking things because they are the ones who are selling the goods to the community of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah's community apparently keeps the Sabbath in terms of internal selling. They're like, well, we don't have to worry about it with us. We don't do that. We don't buy and sell. But hey, these foreigners, they're not in covenant with God anyway. We can do it. But Nehemiah says, no, we're going to have a community rule. We're going to set it straight. We're going to understand the Sabbath in the way that it's meant to be understood. And the list of regulations proceeds directly from the Sabbath day to the sabbatical year. This 7th year that happens where grain is left in the fields, that you don't harvest anything, you don't plant anything, you trust God for the year. And the community here swears to forego working not only on the Sabbath day, but also in that year as well. And the people, they promised to desist from farming, from doing any kind of work. They agreed to cancel all debts. Think about these people and who they are. Think about that, what that means and how willing they would have been to do this because of their situation. They just came, if you go back just a few chapters, if you go back, these are the people in Nehemiah 5, who while building the wall were being oppressed by their creditors. They can't go to work, they can't earn a wage, but yet their creditors were coming in and saying, you still owe us money. And Nehemiah put it to halt. He stopped it. The grace that was given to them on their personal debts just before this, no doubt would have been on their minds. It would have been fresh in their minds. Some have even calculated, I'm not going to go into it today, but just if you want something to study out and look into, some scholars have done some really good work to calculate the time of Nehemiah with the time of the most recent Jubilee year that happened in recorded history before this time. And so some would say that Nehemiah was enacting the Jubilee according to the Torah when he canceled those people's debts. Because he doesn't just cancel debts, or he doesn't just allow for people to have provision. He frees the captives. He frees the slaves. He returns all debts to their creditors. Something that's specifically about the Jubilee. When I think about these things that are going on in these few verses, verses 28 through 31, we see that commitment is contagious. When families, neighbors, and leaders unite for a purpose, incredible things can happen. You ever been a part of something or an organization or a community where it's like, man, there is so much potential if people would just come together. There's so much potential if people can just get on the same page and move forward. That's true because that's what happens. Commitment is contagious. It's not that people aren't able to do the work. It's not that some aren't willing to do the work. It's that a lot of times people aren't committed to doing the work. Commitment means a lot. Commitment means if we don't uphold our end of the bargain, that something is going to falter. In God's kingdom, it means that we're going to have some repercussions. In our normal community activities, it means that something's not going to get done that should get done. It's still the first of the year. We're still in January. You ever tried starting a diet as a family, right? You may have mom skips dessert, dad eats a salad for a week, something like that, but the kids will often complain until they find a stash of cookies, and then the whole diet's out for the whole family. It's because nobody was committed. What kid's going to be committed to eating salad every day, right? Nobody's committed. We need commitment. You ever seen the Amish community when something happens? I remember it's been a while back, but it's kind of like a fabled Amish story that happens all the time, apparently. Someone's barn burns down, the whole community comes together and raises the barn in one day. How long would it take for that barn to go up if that family was doing the work alone? Probably a long time, but they'll raise it in a day. And I've seen it in my own life. I could have run 5 acres of a cattle pasture fence. It would have taken me days. And in my schedule, taken months. But this community and some people outside this community came together and we did it in a day. It's pretty awesome. Commitment is contagious. Commitment to a certain task or a certain goal is contagious. When we look towards the end here, 32 through 39, we see this transition from not taking things to actually taking and giving things. We see a return to the temple service and their offerings. And it actually makes sense. This flow from Sabbath to sanctuary observance makes sense because it's probably taken from Leviticus 26:2 that says, "Keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord." Keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. Leviticus states that the neglect of the sabbatical year will cause national destruction and exile. The refusal to keep the Sabbath and the Sabbath year caused the Israelites before them to lose the temple. So they're very much ingrained and together. And the covenant required tangible sacrifices and offerings. We know these things, first fruits and tithes. And the people commit to themselves something that's not even required, a third shekel temple tax. We're going to bring a third of a shekel. You may say an eighth of an ounce, that's a third of a shekel. In Jesus' time, it's increased to half a shekel. They commit to bringing the showbread, the layer bread. They commit to the perpetual burnt offerings, and they commit to holy and purification offerings. They commit all of these things. What is so unique about this is that prior to this, it's basically the responsibility of the Levites, of the priests, to be able to get these things, to maintain them, to keep the service going. But here the people say it's not just their responsibility, but it's ours. It's not just their responsibility, but ours. Nathan, a few weeks ago, talked about how he prays for our leaders in our community all the time. Sometimes we look at our leaders and our representative, even the presidential office, and we say that's their responsibility to do what we need. No, we all have a responsibility. We all have the response, and it may be as little as responsible for praying for them. And that's not a little task. These people bring these offerings. They commit themselves, not just the priests and Levites, but all the people of Israel. And there's a distinction that's made between holy and purification offerings. And I thought, well, aren't all offerings holy? The distinction was curious to me. But just a few weeks ago in our Leviticus study, in Leviticus 21, it talks about the Shelomim offerings, or the free will offerings, and I had never really paid attention before. I think Seth brought it up. He had a question about it. Because in Leviticus 21, we know that all offerings had to be without blemish, but then you get to Leviticus 21 and talk about this free will offering. It's the offering that people could bring for themselves. It was brought willfully, and then it was consumed by the people that brought it. It could be given for a free will or a completion of a vow or just thanksgiving. I want to thank God for some blessing in my life. And then they would eat it, and you had to eat it within a few days, no matter the size of it. But what was interesting that Seth noticed was that this offering could have short legs. This offering could have a couple of blemishes. And why? Well, because it seems that maybe it was, in history, they call it the lesser holy offerings. Still holy, but they're lesser holy. They're not going to God, they're going to the people, and they're given on their own free will. Maybe that's what's talked about here, I'm not sure. But it says that all of these things are being brought together and being promised for commitment before so that they will atone for Israel. One of my favorite topics. And as we've gone through Leviticus, it would take a long time for people to get out of the mindset of the word atone or atonement, because I would suggest that's not a proper word. We don't quite understand that. That it would mean to purge for Israel or to cleanse for Israel. Because our sin is what cleanses the house of God, the sin offering, the purgation offering, the purging and the cleansing of these offerings is what cleanses our sin from the house of God. The house of God is supernaturally tainted by our sin. It was tainted in the physical world back then and tainted now in the heavenly. It says that Jesus offers continuous in the heavenly realm for us. But the concept here, because the temple tax is even included in this, it's even the giving of money that is able to help cleanse God's house from their sin. Because the temple tax allowed for them to have the provisions they needed to continue this service. And again, this kind of flies in the face of how we talk about things today. We'll say, well, the tithe is not monetary, or the tithe, They saw that giving, whether you want to call it a tithe or not, was important for the maintenance of God's house. What's interesting to me is verse 34. I never paid attention to this very much before either, but the wood had to be instructed to be brought in. This gathering of wood. And it says that it was prescribed in the law, and I had to think about it. Nowhere in the Torah does God say, y'all will go gather wood. But they said it's prescribed in the law. I kind of had to think about this, meditate on this. Gathering wood is not prescribed, but what is? Burnt offerings. Guess what? You need wood for a burnt offering. And you need a really large amount of wood. The people here are committing themselves, not just the priests, to maintaining the collection of wood. Seems like a small task, but While it's true that Ezra and Nehemiah here records the earliest regular collection of this wood for the altar, and he doesn't really say anything about a festival, when we get to the Second Temple period, we have people talking about this festival of wood, something they added to it. Josephus records the festival of the wood offering on the 15th day of the 5th month, the month of Av, when all the people were accustomed to bring wood for the altar. Never paid attention to that before. So on the 15th day of the 5th month, interestingly, leading up to Sukkot, when you would have tons of offerings, the people would go gather sticks and bring them to the temple. They would gather sticks and bring them in. Later, the Mishnah says that there's 9 times in the year when certain families brought wood, and one of the times was a public collection from all the people, the 15th of Av. It's just interesting to me that the people were unified here in Nehemiah's time, and it lasted for hundreds of years just to go pick up sticks and bring in the wood. And we end with this reinstitution of first fruits and tithing, where tithing is executed along the days of first fruits and the holidays, and even if when it wasn't, that the priest would go out and they would collect it, they would store it, and they would use it to maintain the temple services. The people promised to bring their first fruits of all that they had. I was thinking about our community here. You know, I'm not eating donuts right now. I'm on my yearly diet we talked about. I'm not eating donuts. But there are certain people here that when I get here, they're like, hey, Matt, there was a filled one over there I saved just for you. I love a filled donut. Some of y'all like the blueberry donuts because some people will set aside a blueberry donut for some of y'all. Imagine having to give up your blueberry, your filled donut every week. If there's only one filled donut, that means I don't get a filled donut. God gets it. I think it's important to prioritize God in our finances and resources. I'm not going to have a message here. We're at the end. I'm not going to do anything about tithing. But I just think it's important that we prioritize that we make decisions that are kingdom decisions with our money. I was listening to a podcast, Sean Ryan, he's an ex-Navy SEAL. He had, I forgot how to say his name. His last name is Babin. His first name is Leif Babin. Another ex-Navy SEAL. He wrote a book. If you haven't read it, it's called Extreme Ownership. Really good book about leadership. And I had no idea. I've read the book several times. Had no idea Leif Garrett was a devout Christian. Grew up in a Christian home. His dad was, I think, a dentist, he said, and had 7 kids and instilled God into them from the day they were born. And he was talking to him. They were in buds together, the course for becoming a Navy SEAL. And in the show, it was just interesting that he was talking about being in buds together. And he's like, we were doing Bible studies at buds. And Sean Ryan, the guy who runs the podcast, said, I had no idea. Y'all were doing Bible study in the midst of all that? He's like, yeah, man, we were doing Bible study. They get to a part of the show, and something came up because Sean is asking Leif about the Bible because now it's turned into this podcast about the Bible instead of leadership from the Navy SEALs. And he says, what's up with this verse about the rich people entering the kingdom of heaven? And it was a cool little conversation that happened, but Leif said, it's all about how we utilize the resources that we have. Because God will give us much if we utilize them the right way. He referenced Abraham, who came from nothing and was given tons of wealth, but it was because Abraham used his wealth. I think that on our day, whether you give here, I know a ton of people here that give to other places. I think that's amazing. I was talking with someone the other day that didn't go to church here. He's like, man, I feel guilty because I don't give all my tithe to the church. I give it directly in the community sometimes. And I'm like, dude, I don't think you should feel guilty about that at all. You're doing kingdom work with the things that God has given you. That's what they were doing here. They committed themselves not just to relegate what happens in the temple and in their country to the priest and the Levites and the governor. They committed themselves to the responsibility of it. So what does this mean today? I think that it's a chapter where we can understand that leadership with faith is needed. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a friend, someone who is in some type of role, no matter what the role is, you have somebody who's watching you as an example. Every single person here. I think this chapter gives us the importance of building a faithful community, that we have to stay involved in this church and other churches. People have to be involved in the community of God. It's not a solo journey. I don't know where we were talking about it this week. I was talking with someone in some study about how we individualize our faith, especially here in America. But that's largely not what the Bible represents. The Bible presents a communal faith. And I think we see that really big here in this chapter. And I think that whether it's money, time, or talents, giving to God shows where our priorities are. That sacrificial giving is a blessing both to God, to those around us, and to ourselves. The lady in the Sunday church, she asked me last week, she said, I just want to do a pulse check with you because you got work all week, Wednesday night, studies on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Saturday church, Sunday church. And I said, you know what? My best part of the week is any chance I get to talk about the Word of God. I'm invigorated by it. I'm energized by it. Anybody else feel that way? Like every time you get to talk about the Bible, you like, I could be dead asleep. I could have stayed up all night long, but when I get up here and I get to share what God has shown me, I'm energized. It gives me all the energy I need. So whether you're giving money, time, or talents, give it. Give it to give God glory. I think that commitment goes beyond words. Because last chapter we saw a lot of great words from this community. But this chapter we see real commitment. People are signing on the dotted line. What if every time you made a commitment to anybody? I think last week or last chapter we talked about you want to take one step in being a better, faithful Christian, just keep your word. What if every time you made any type of statement of obligation, somebody whipped out a piece of paper and said, will you sign on that? How much more would our life look like? How much better would our life look like if that happened? I think that there is power in covenant that's rooted in action. That's what's going on here. There's power in the covenant that's rooted in action. When we remove action from any covenant, it grows weak. I think all the time we hear people say, and we do ourselves, I'll pray about that. I said it recently. And then it took me about 5 seconds to realize, I don't need to pray about that. God has already called us to do things. He's already called us to go out and represent His kingdom. He's already called us to pour into the younger generations. We don't need to pray about a lot of stuff we pray about. I'm not saying don't pray. Don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of things that we don't have to pray about, that we just need to put action to the covenant that we have committed to. What steps can you take this week to live out your commitment to God? Join me in prayer. Father, we come before you today and we thank you for your word. We thank you for the covenant that you have enacted with us through Yeshua's sacrifice and his resurrection. We thank you that we have a hope and a future resurrection because Yeshua, Jesus, our first fruits, was raised from the dead. We thank you for your word and the acts of your sovereignty and commitment to the covenant promise you made with our ancestors throughout the ages so that we could have real faith and hope in the promises that you've given us. A promise to bring us into the fullness of your kingdom, to live a life removed from any despair or any kind of strife. We thank you that you've given us the obligation and the responsibility and the honor of bearing your image in the world today. I pray that these words that we read today and the words that you spoke through your scriptures would encourage the people today to live this week with a stronger sense of commitment to their covenant with you. We love you. We bless you. We give you thanks for all that you've given us. Amen. So we'll have